Hello, Mustang fans, and welcome to the Mustang Owners Podcast. I'm John Clore, Enthusiast Communications Manager for Ford Performance, along with my co-host, Mike Ray, who is president of the Mustang Owners Club of Southeastern Michigan and the International Council of Mustang Clubs. You know, we've long said that everyone's got a Mustang story. So that's why we work so hard to bring you all the inside stories behind all the cool cars, the clubs, the collectors, the celebrities, and the characters that we know so well in this Mustang and Ford world of ours. All we ask in return is that please make sure you're subscribed to the Mustang Owners Podcast so you can be notified when we upload a new episode. And tonight, Mike, we're going to have a great episode for people who love performance Mustangs and performance Fords because we've got a real winner.
This is the best part about this, is that we get to bring you the behind-the-scenes stories that no one else gets to see or hear.
Well, and it's just because we have so many friends in the business at Ford, and you know, a lot of times, I've worked all those years in marketing for SVT and racing, and now Ford Performance, and then the guys working behind the scenes making the cars. Sometimes we don't get to mix, and that's why we're really excited to bring our special guest, a super Ford engineer, Eric Zinkosky. Thank you and welcome to the Mustang Owners Podcast.
Yeah. Glad to be here.
No, we're glad to have you because when we found out, first of all, when I found out that all the cars that you touched while I was out there slinging marketing, you were out there making great cars with all of the great people behind the scenes at both, SVT, Ford Racing, and Ford Performance. And then I heard you retired. I go, you can't retire, Eric, because we haven't even talked yet. And then by the time we got you on the podcast, the rumor is you're working back at Ford. How did that happen?
Yeah, they gave me, after about 30 years at Ford, I took my retirement, and they gave me 6 weeks of retirement. And then they offered me a consulting contract to come back and work a little bit on the racing side. I've got a lot of interest in the NASCAR side, and they thought I could help there. But also, I'm still back on Ford Performance on the road car side, helping on some of the future projects. I had a lot of projects in flight, and they just said, we got to keep you working. So.
Well, Eric, that is your blessing, because sometimes you got too much experience and knowledge. And what did you say, Mike Long? Knowledge is power.
Yeah, it absolutely is. That's true.
Yeah. So, at any big corporation, it was always great to see the old guys go because they bring in the kids because they're cheaper. But sometimes they don't know a lot of the stuff that we old guys know, Eric. And I'm so glad that you're back making Fords go fast again. But that's not what we want to talk about so much about the podcast tonight. We heard that when you started tinkering with high performance Fords, we want to learn how you got into the Mustang part of the business. And we heard that you actually got to work alongside some of the greats, including all those people known with that word. What is it, Mike? Shelby?
Yeah.
So, Eric, how did you get into the Mustang side of the Ford business, and how did you first get into working on any Shelby vehicles?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I was actually working over at Roush Racing, and a Ford manager saw me over there and saw some of the stuff I was doing, and he recruited me to come to the Ford Advanced Chassis and Vehicle Dynamics Group. And literally, my first day in the door, they handed me the project to retune all the Bondurant Mustangs for the school cars.
Wow.
And they needed somebody who could sit behind the wheel and work with Mr. Bondurant directly. And that was had its own challenges. And and so my first job was literally tuning those bright orange cars for the Bondurant school.
Oh, my God. Eric, do you know that I actually had to go through that school with the SVT marketing team? And I remember Bob, I know I don't want to do my own, Mike, you should stop me now, because I remember when Bob came in to our classroom and he always had that grin on his face, Eric, remember? And he'd go, hey, he had his thumb up all the time. Hey, boys, what do you think about them Cobras, huh? Easy on the throttle, easy on the steering. He was a character, Eric. And those Cobras, I mean, people that went to that Bondurant school, the SVT school, they got their money's worth.
Yeah, and he was a challenge to sit next to in the passenger seat and ride with. As we were tuning those cars, he would insist on, here, crawl in there and let me show you what I'm talking about. And he would go throw it into a corner and do what he did. And my job was to get out and turn to the mechanic and tell him what stabilizer bar to change. Well, I took a run to the restroom to get myself back together.
Well, Eric, you weren't unfortunate enough to know. And Mike, this is the worst thing. Anybody tell you Bondurant school, they'll give you this ride in, what was that, Econoline E350 with the 15 passenger, and then Bob would drive it on the track when you thought you were going ass over apple cart any second now. That, Eric, did you have to survive one of those too?
No, I witnessed that. And I was out at Firebird doing some testing and tuning, and of course you're driving, and there's a microphone in there that you can talk on, but you have to take one hand off the wheel to do. And of course I'm horsing the car around as fast as I can using both hands and just hoping to hang on. And Bob just drives up right behind me, and he starts talking to me, and I don't know how he's shifting gears, holding the microphone and talking at the same time. And oh, by the way, he could pass me at any moment. So yeah, it was,
he was absolute. Mike, that's a true character.
I got to meet Bob a couple times.
I think I was second row from the back, and if you had any cookies, you'd toss them. But it was more fear than anything else, Eric, because E350s with 12 people in it are not meant to go around corners like that. But he sure knew where apexes were, knew how to he could drive. But so you got indoctrinated with the SVT group pretty early on. But then, and as you know, we wound up in the Roush building. I was over at 57. You guys were in 56 when I cut to SVT, and but you touched some of the Cobras as well. Beyond that school, some of the street cars.
Yeah. And again, working in the advanced chassis group, I was kind of a resource to any and all of the programs that were being developed. And there was a group of people one floor up from me that was trying to figure out how to put an independent rear suspension in the old Fox body car.
Yeah.
And they all kept running up against the same problem, which was the chassis wasn't really built for an independent rear suspension. And to make it work, they were going to have to retool the whole back of the car. And money just wasn't allocated to do that.
Yeah.
And but about once a week, somebody would come down with a sketch and an idea and say, what about this? Could we do this? Could we do that? Maybe we try this. And I finally got fed up with it. And I went home one day and pulled out the drawings and literally laid it out on a board manually and took it back in. And I handed it to him and I said, that will work if you want to. It's a bolt-in independent rear suspension. Let's do that. And again, there was no money, there was no resources to do it. So they sent me out to Roush, and we got a couple of designers at Roush, and I spent 3 months laying one out and building the first prototype. And after that, the car sold itself. We showed it to Jackie Stewart at an SVT kind of, senior management show. And he got out and he said, who's in charge of this? I got to talk to somebody. What is this? And from then on, it was just, when was it going to go to production and who was going to lead that? So, yeah, that one worked out pretty good.
Well, the chief engineer, I know, Art Hyde, he wanted that to be done and couldn't get it to happen in mainstream. And it made only sense that something custom like that you guys had to adapt, that made sense that SVT would take that challenge on, because, we could go out with those cars and go to meet with the media and go after, racetracks and talk to a lot of the journalists that I used to work with. And they would say the same thing. Well, it's a great little car, but it's got a stick axle in it. Mm-hmm. And then, the line was, well, they were better for drag racing, and they were, because we used to, when we first went to the IRS, we got some wheel hop, and they thought we were playing a little basketball back there. But that really made the Cobras cross the line, Eric, to become a sports car. And the fact that you got to have a hand in it, that had to be a lot of fun, but that couldn't have been fun when they put more horsepower in the car.
No, I mean, it had its limitations. It was what it was. And when we stepped up to the Terminator, there were a lot of things we had to do. There's some parts back there that just wouldn't stand up to the beating. So we had to go back and retool and rethink those. And we had to put some stiffer bushings in places. And that wheel hop you talk about wasn't really wheel hop. It was what they call driveline shutter. Mm-hmm. It was winding up the half shafts and the drive shaft, and it would actually rock the motor and the half shaft plus or minus 10 degrees. And so the wheel wouldn't actually jump up and down. It would just stick slip.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Oh, wow.
it felt like wheel hop, but it was not. Yeah.
Well, I
And
think Tom Chapman, who was one of our chassis
yeah,
engineers, yeah, he would come back all the time and talk. That's so great, Eric. What a great, what a change that is for Mustang. And it's
yeah,
kind of like when Coletti decided to put the supercharge in the car, that changed its personality too. But
yeah.
you kept going after that SN95, and I understand you actually got to touch the S197 as well.
Yeah, and again, advanced chassis. After I finished the Cobra IRS, we started working on what would be the S197, and they put me in a pretty good position there to lead that. They made me a vehicle dynamics and chassis technical specialist, and I got to work with the teams packaging the advanced stuff, and we actually had an independent rear suspension in the S197.
Now,
And
Ellen Collins tried to get that passed for the Cobra before we turned that into the Shelby Mustang, and then financially they had us take it out.
yeah,
And
it was really actually very late in the program. The team and I had laid out an independent rear suspension that was program direction, and they got to a point where money and finance and tooling was just not there. And they gave a small group of us, myself and a very elite group of engineers, 8 weeks to redesign the back half of the car and put the solid axle back in.
oh,
Wow.
And at that point, like the rear fenders and quarter panels were already, tooled, and we couldn't touch it. So it was like, get the tires inside the quarter panels. Don't touch any of the sheet metal we see. Redesign the back half of the car. And we were pretty happy. We built a prototype in 8 weeks and parked it in the chief engineer's parking spot one morning and said, "We're done. Here you go."
Was that Parasec at the time, or was that Hao Tai Tang?
Hao Tai Tang had taken over the group at that point.
Right.
Art Hyde had moved on, and Hao was there. So we got his admin to give us the key to the parking lot, and we put our prototype in his parking spot and said, "That's the best we can do, boss, in 8 weeks."
Well, Mike and I both we bit off on that one, Mike, because we both own S197s.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we couldn't leave them alone.
Yeah.
Mike says, Eric, if you stood behind Mike's car, you wouldn't hear anything for 2 weeks after that. What the heck happened to Mike?
I got the GT500 exhaust on it, headers, and no catalytic converter, so it plays pretty loud.
To all the listeners out there, that car is totally illegal.
You think?
But it's unfortunately, the Eric can't work on illegal stuff. But let's take a little pit stop here so we can thank those who make the Mustang Owners Podcast possible, including our platform provider, which is the Mustang Owners Museum down there in Charlotte, actually Concord, North Carolina. As we have to thank them because that's the spiritual home of Mustang now, is built by enthusiasts for enthusiasts, and also RJ Media Services, which is Gerard Ferrioli, our producer. And we'd also like to thank you, our listeners, because making us the top-rated Mustang podcast, it's a pride point for both Mike and I. So to reward you, Mike's Club and I have worked together to give you a discount when you order your Ford, the collector's edition set, and just in time for Christmas. It's this gigantic Ford set of a 120-year history book, which is over 140 or 410 pages. It's a collection of pull-out memorabilia, replica brochures and letters from Thomas Edison to Mr. Ford. It's in this beautiful presentation case with 10 replica badges, off all the greatest Fords you've ever remembered. And it's this precision crafted Ford vehicle collector set that you could only get through iconicglobalsports.com. There's never been anything like this for a Ford collector, and it's a limited run. So we can save you $50 by just typing in Mike's Club acronym, MOXEM, when you order your Ford, the collector's edition, off iconicglobalsports.com. That's MOCSEM. We'll give you $50. Thanks for being our listener. So let's get back on track with Eric Zinkosky. This has been a trip down memory lane, Eric, because all the great Mustangs and Cobras, but that's not where you stop, because after the S197 came out, chassis guys, there became way more, I think, Eric, of an interest in handling after they said, S550 is going to get an IRS one, and we're going to both put an IRS in it, and by God, we're going to export it.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, as S197 moved over into SVT, and they brought Carroll Shelby back on board, and they were going to introduce the new Shelby GT500. The leadership over there brought me over and had me join the staff to try to make the best, GT500 we could for Carroll Shelby.
Yeah,
and so that's how I got over to.
So you must have been there at the Ford test track when Carroll came out and drove some of the early prototypes there in Dearborn up and down the hill, and everybody and their brother came out, and he did want to have a lot of input on that car. Originally that was supposed to be the '06 SVT Mustang Cobra, and then when SVT was dissolved and that became the GT500, he had some pretty high standards. And Eric, as I recall, he said, if I were to build my own Mustang for 2007, this is the car I'd do. So you must have worked pretty closely with what he wanted on that car.
Yeah, Carroll and I were actually, I don't know exactly why he adopted me, but I think it was because I could get him in cars anytime he wanted. So I get that phone call that said, "Boy, where are you testing tomorrow? I thought I'd come into town." And,
okay.
and my job was to find him a car. So, but yeah, I worked with him on that car that we introduced as the 2007 Shelby. And in fact, one of the interesting things, the fun things at the media event for that, they did a media event out west, and we had set up a track day, and my job was to run the track day. Carroll had spent the whole time up in a suite doing interviews with the journalists, one by one, and he came down toward the end of the event, and he said, "I want to drive my car." And the communications people at Ford and his handlers were saying, "Yeah, it's kind of late, and maybe you shouldn't drive." And
yeah.
I walked up with a helmet and said, "Carroll, we're going to go drive your car." And I think at that point I became his instant buddy. And,
but Eric, you knew darn well that at that point he couldn't see for a damn thing.
Well, that was the funny part of this whole event. So I get him over to a car and I'm strapping him in, and he says, "Listen, I don't know this course very well, and I don't see so good in the sunshine." And he said, "So when we get to the corners, you just point which way they go." And at that point, I had two conflicting voices in my head. One said, "You get to go ride with Carroll Shelby on a racetrack. This is cool." Oh. And there was this self-preservation one that was going, "Oh my God.
Get out of the car."
Yeah. And so I don't know if I'm proud of this, but I actually turned to one of my subordinates and said, "Hey, why don't you get in with Carroll and let him run around the track with you?" And Carroll did what Carroll always did. He did a reconnaissance lap, and he figured out where the corners were. And then the next time down the straightaway, he turned the car flat sideways, smoke coming off the rear tires, one hand out the window waving, and just drove it all the way down the straightaway. And I turned to the communications guy and I said, "That's why you let Carroll drive the car."
Yeah.
That's awesome.
There's nothing.
We have an 07 GT500 on my showroom floor, John.
Yep.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's that car that changed everything, and the whole relationship. To see Etzel and Carroll walk back into that building in Route 57, and we knew something was up. And how was along with him. We said, "You know what? Remember, he wanted to put those Shelby letters on the trunk. We didn't have that on there." And I remember Scarpello at the time. "Oh, come on. I mean, that's hard. That was hard work to figure out. We didn't want to drill the deck lid. But it had to say Eric. It had to say Shelby on it because that was Carroll's car."
It did. And then, shortly after that, he wanted to do the anniversary KR version.
Oh, yeah.
And so he got bigger Shelby letters. He got very bright leaders. He got that forward-facing snorkel hood. On that one, basically, Ford did all the engineering and development on that car, and then we handed the formula to them where they converted the cars in their Las Vegas facility.
Wow.
But myself and a very talented engineer named Andy Vrenko did all the chassis tuning, all the brake development, all the tire selection, the whole deal on that. And you can still find online, there's a couple of links to some videos of me taking Carroll for a drive at the proving grounds in that, again, a sunny day. And he turned to me and said, "I can't drive, you better drive." So,
well, all you listeners out there better go check out and Google that, because that'll definitely be worth watching. We know, Eric, that, at that point, the Shelby GT came out. I know they worked with Ford Racing Parts. Did you guys ever sit down with any of those boys? Because they were trying to, take parts that were proven on the track. We were doing a Mustang racing series and work with those chassis guys, because Shelby GTs were made also in Las Vegas.
Yeah, and we always joke that at SVT we would come up with all these new hardware and the new brakes and the new stuff, and then the next year that would somehow show up on a Mustang GT or somebody's aftermarket
They
stuff
stole it
as a kit. And we always thought maybe they should help us pay for the tooling, because they ultimately ended up with the parts. But yeah, we did a lot of we did a lot of that. So yeah, and we were always available to consult with what you want.
Well, how did all that work for these streetcars? Get your nose into the racing side of the business.
Well, I mean, I'm a racer at heart. Before I actually became an engineer, decided to actually give up on my driving, I was actually trying to be Richard Petty's replacement. So I traveled around the country with a super late model and raced against people like Rusty Wallace and Alan Kowicki and Mark Martin, and they got good, and I went back to school. And so I've always had that interest. And so, the Ford racing people are literally across the hall from the road car side of Ford Performance. And so I've always been walking across the hall and saying, what do you need and what can I help with today? And, just doing that. And that's a big part of what I'm doing now for them, is a lot of work on chassis setup and improving some of the NASCAR setups. So
down in Charlotte on the simulators and working on with the race teams?
Yeah, I'm down in Charlotte at least once a month. In 2015, I put together the simulation and CAE group at Ford Performance for the road car side.
Okay.
And when we went down and figured out how to use the simulators down there to do road car development. So all of the GT350 Mustang was developed on the simulator down there, and the GT500 that followed. We did all of the tuning virtually before we ever built a car.
Wow.
And we've now advanced to the point where we do Raptor trucks in the simulator as well. We do a lot of the work in tuning in the full vehicle simulator before we ever build a vehicle.
Well, Mike, it's performance sales. When you talk about GT350s and GT500s and the 350Rs and the Raptors, that's what makes everybody tick on the performance side working in that dealership.
Absolutely. And I was privileged to be on the launch team, Eric, for the GT350 and the S550. And I remember hearing those stories about the simulator and things like that. And that GT350 is just an amazing car, all ready to go road car. You take it to the road course, it's ready to go. And it was just a pleasure and an honor to be on the launch team with that. And you guys did one hell of a job.
Yeah. And that is, to date, that to me is the best we've done in terms of a balanced, streetable, raceable car. That car, in my mind, wanted for nothing. It was the right weight. It had the right brakes. That motor was just incredible.
Yeah.
And to me, that was the last car where I led the vehicle dynamics and development before I jumped off for CAE and simulation and did that. But that's the one I put on the shelf that's as good as we've done. Or good
before that, remember everybody was talking the Boss 302, how well balanced that car was.
Yeah.
And the 12 and 13, and then the GT350 just came along, and it's like, wow, we could get better. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I like that, and certainly the GT500, we did a lot of work and development on that in the simulator, and I sort of call that the Rambo car. I mean, you took the GT350 and you bolted a bigger motor on it with bigger tires and bigger fenders and more aero, and it's fast, but when I was testing the GT350, I'd be going at VIR, I'd be going down the back straightaway and, out the braking zone at 335 miles an hour. I drove the GT500 the first time and I saw the needle go north of 150. And I went, at 60 years old, maybe I should not do this.
Well, I don't know if you know this, Eric. You probably don't. A lot of people and our listeners probably don't know it, but Mike Ray had to give up an illustrious racing career, but he did most of his racing on Telegraph Road and Fifth Street, and he gave it up so that he didn't get arrested. It is Mustang.
That was my high school thing. Telegraph.
That was me too.
Telegraph from the Taco Bell.
Yeah.
Yep.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
Well,
that's awesome.
Now, Mike, if that doesn't prove that Eric Zinkosky is one of us.
Yeah. Where did you grow up? And did you grow up in Dearborn, Eric?
I grew up in the Allen Park area, and at the time it wasn't a Ford, but it had flames down the side of it. So if you raced it, you know it.
There you go.
Yeah, that's right. And nobody liked racing it. That's it. If it had anything to do with you, Eric. But we want to come back, and we've got a lot of good stuff to talk about. So hopefully we can get you back on the podcast and talk a little bit about those times with Shelby. A lot of our listeners love to hear all that interaction, and unfortunately, there was so very few of us had a chance to work with him. And then when we had Mike, when we had Coletti on. We just touched the tip of the iceberg of all the great things that I think the teams that the performance teams, Eric, that's where the magic happens at Ford. And nothing against all the other engineers that do work on the mainstream car, but you guys, you create the passion.
Yeah.
And you can still see it when we talk to everybody, right? You know, like all the SPT engineers we've had on in the past their passion is just through the roof, just like Eric's.
Yeah. They're all great guys, and they're all, what you and I call gearheads. I mean, they all either race or build their own cars, or they're just an incredible bunch. And even, I walked out of there July 31st on my last day, but the people that are there are just amazing. And it's a privilege for me to go back and spend 15 or 16 hours a week with them still. Even at 65 years old, they let me play. So I like it.
Yeah.
Well, Eric Zinkosky, it was our pleasure, and it's a privilege to have us talking to you. Hopefully you can come back and talk to us again and share some more of your great stories. Really appreciate your time tonight on the podcast.
Anytime.
Mike, how was that? That was pretty cool, huh?
Yeah.
We got to have Eric back.
Love the behind the scenes stories, and no one else gets to hear that. I mean, you can only hear that here. That's why you encourage our listeners to spread the word.
We got to get Eric back, and we really appreciate his time. Well, folks, that's a wrap for this edition of the Mustang Owners Podcast. But don't forget to check out the enthusiast section of FordPerformance.com this week. He's probably going to have a story about you. And if you haven't already done so, get your Mustang or Facebook group registered on FordPerformanceClubConnect.com and on the Special Vehicle Registry. You can also find out what Mike's Mega Club is up to by visiting Moxum.com. And as always, we welcome your suggestions and your comments to clubhub@ford.com. So until next time, we'll just have to catch you down the road.